I'm 29 now, and 2 months ago my marriage of 2 years ended in the worst way imaginable. My ex-wife, Claire, 27, had been cheating on me with my younger brother Tom, who's also 27. They'd been together for a while behind my back, and 4 months ago, Claire dropped the bombshell. She was pregnant. At first she tried to convince me the baby was mine, but the way Tom was always around and a few suspicious glances between them planted a seed of doubt. I needed the truth, so one night while she was asleep, I went through her phone. I wish I hadn't. The messages I found between Claire and Tom confirmed my worst fears. It was his baby. They hadn't just been fooling around. They'd been planning a whole future together without me, and they weren't even going to tell me until after the baby was born. Their plan? Claire would divorce me and get with Tom, all while they lived off the child support they'd demand from me. The next morning, I confronted her. She tried to deny it at first, but she knew she had nowhere left to hide. She finally admitted everything. That was the end of my marriage, just like that. My whole world came crashing down, and it felt like a gut punch I'd never recover from. But the shock didn't end there. You see, I hadn't been close with my family for years. Ever since I left home at 18, they'd treated me like an outsider. Tom had always been the golden child, the one who could do no wrong. Meanwhile, I was just there. One time, after I was accepted to college, I found out my parents threw Tom a party. When I asked why they didn't celebrate my achievement, they told me that it would have made Tom feel left out. They acted like I should be the one lifting him up instead of feeling hurt. That was the last straw, and I decided then and there that I'd never come back. I worked my way through college, taking out loans and working part-time jobs, and when I graduated, I rented a small apartment with a friend and started my life on my own. My family never once reached out. They never apologized, never checked in on me, and I had no plans to go back. Years went by, and I built my own life, met Claire, got married, and settled into a comfortable existence. Then, out of nowhere, Tom reached out online last year saying he missed me and wanted to reconnect. He told me that our parents regretted how things had gone down and wanted to mend things with me. Maybe it was some leftover hope that things could be different, or maybe I just needed closure. Whatever the reason, I agreed to meet them. Our first meeting was awkward, and there was a lot of tension. But they seemed to be making an effort, so I thought I owed it to myself to try too. I invited them over to my house to start rebuilding the relationship. And that, I realize now, was my first big mistake. It didn't take long for Tom to get friendly with Claire, and soon he was a regular presence in our home. I was happy to see him and my wife getting along. I thought it meant the beginning of a stronger family bond. When Claire told me she was pregnant, I was overjoyed. I'd wanted to be a father, and everything seemed like it was finally falling into place. But then Tom's visits started becoming more frequent and his behavior more unsettling. He'd often place his hand on Claire's stomach and whisper to the baby, acting strangely attached to her pregnancy. Claire brushed it off, insisting it wasn't a big deal, but something felt off. That creeping suspicion gnawed at me, and finally, 6 months into the pregnancy, I gave in. I went through Claire's phone and found the evidence I'd feared. Their affair hadn't just been a fling. It was a full-blown relationship with plans to start a life together at my expense. The reality of it broke me in ways I didn't think possible. When I confronted Claire the next morning, she broke down, knowing she was caught. She admitted to everything, including their plan to wait until after the baby's birth to come clean. It was a betrayal so complete, so cruel, that I felt like I'd lost my wife, my family, and even the chance to be a father. I filed for divorce that very week, but my family's betrayal was far from over. When Claire and Tom announced their relationship online and shared the news of her pregnancy, my parents rallied behind them. They supported my ex-wife and my brother, acting like I should just be happy for them. They acted as if Tom and Claire were the victims and told me that I should celebrate their happiness. That cut deep, but at that point I was too numb to feel anything. I just wanted to get as far away from them as possible. The divorce itself was another nightmare. My parents actually testified in favor of Claire, supporting her claim that I'd been controlling and toxic in our marriage. She walked away with a large chunk of my savings, my car, and the support of everyone I'd once called family. The only thing I managed to hold on to was my house. Once the papers were signed, I was relieved. I'd lost almost everything, but at least I was free from their lies, manipulation, and betrayal. I threw myself into my work, using the pain as fuel to push forward. After the divorce, I poured myself into work, using every ounce of energy to leave my past behind. It wasn't easy, but it was the only way to escape the grief and betrayal that felt like a weight on my chest every day. Work became my refuge. I pushed myself harder, took on new projects, and gradually, the endless hours started paying off. 2 weeks ago, I got promoted, better pay, a higher position, and even a nicer company car. It was a rare moment of true happiness, something I hadn't felt in a long time. To celebrate, I treated myself to a solo dinner at one of my favorite restaurants. I felt proud and content, like I was finally moving forward. I posted about it online, a simple picture with a caption about my promotion. I thought nothing of it. It was just a small, personal victory. But within a day, I got a call from my mother. Her tone was casual, almost cheerful, as she asked if I could come by to visit. The request caught me off guard. She hadn't called or spoken to me since the divorce, and they'd made it clear they were on my ex's side. I ignored her first message, but she kept calling, leaving voicemails about wanting to catch up. When that didn't work, she showed up at my office, causing a scene with the receptionist until I finally agreed to visit them. It was an embarrassing moment, but I wanted to avoid more drama, so I promised to come by. A few days later, I went to see my family. As I pulled up to their new house, a bigger place, clearly bought with the money from my divorce settlement, I couldn't help but feel a pang of bitterness. This was the life they'd chosen, and now, because of it, we were all strangers. Inside, my mother greeted me with forced warmth, and my father sat awkwardly, avoiding eye contact. I waited for them to get to the point, and after a few minutes of uncomfortable silence, my dad finally spoke up. My brother, he explained, had lost his job, and the money from the settlement wasn't enough to cover their expenses anymore. They needed help to support my brother, my ex, and their newborn baby. Hearing this, I was speechless. It was almost surreal that they'd even ask, considering everything that had happened. My father told me that since I was doing well now, I should help the family out. They spoke as if we'd been on good terms, as if they hadn't treated me like an outsider my entire life. My stomach churned with anger and disbelief. I didn't even know how to respond. Part of me wanted to scream at them, but I also knew that would just give them the satisfaction of knowing they'd gotten to me. So I stood up without a word and headed for the door, feeling an overwhelming need to get as far away from them as possible. When I opened the door to leave, I found Tom standing outside, looking surprised to see me. My parents tried to stop me, pleading for me to stay and hear them out. But I pushed past them, stepping out into the pouring rain. It was a short walk to my car, but by the time I got there, I was drenched and furious. The rain felt almost cleansing, washing away the remnants of the old life I was leaving behind. As I fumbled for my car keys, Tom and my parents followed me outside, still trying to get my attention. This time it was Tom who spoke up, asking me to help them out just this once. He was desperate, but I could still see the arrogance in his eyes, the entitlement that had always been there. For once, he was the one in need, and I was the one who could provide. I snapped. Years of frustration, resentment, and betrayal finally boiled over, and I told them exactly what I thought. I told them to leave me alone, that they could beg on the streets for all I cared. A stranger would probably have more pity on them than I ever would. Without another word, I got in my car and drove off, leaving them standing in the rain. I didn't look back. The day after my confrontation with my family, the texts and calls began again. My mother was relentless, sending me guilt-laden messages, insisting that it was my duty to help the family in their time of need. She said I was being selfish and heartless, that I'd abandoned them despite all they'd done for me. But each time I read those messages, the anger only grew. I hadn't abandoned anyone. They had abandoned me a long time ago. A few days later, my brother showed up at my house unannounced. When I opened the door, he looked at me with that familiar, smug expression that I'd grown to despise. But his face softened, trying to look earnest, as he told me he was sorry for how I'd been treated as a child. Then he quickly followed it up by explaining that it wasn't his fault he'd been favored. He was just inherently better than me, and that's why our parents always treated him like the golden child. As he spoke, he seemed oblivious to how ridiculous he sounded. He suggested that I stop holding grudges and be mature, that it was time I let go of the past and do what any responsible family member would do, support them financially. I couldn't believe he thought this little speech would make me change my mind. I let out a laugh, unable to hide my disbelief, and told him he was delusional. That touched a nerve. His tone shifted and the smug mask fell off. He sneered at me, saying that I was just jealous that not only our parents but even my ex-wife had preferred him over me. He spat out that I was just taking revenge by refusing to give them money. I didn't even bother to argue. I told him that if revenge is what he wanted to call it, fine. I wasn't going to lift a finger for them. Then I pointed out that he should probably spend less time trying to manipulate me and more time finding a job to support his new family. His face twisted with anger, and he yelled that he would make me regret turning my back on him and the family. He promised he'd find a way to get what he wanted, and that I'd be sorry for abandoning them. But his words didn't shake me. I could see right through the threats. Tom might have been good at manipulating our parents, but he had no power over me anymore. After he left, I felt a strange sense of calm, like I'd finally broken free from the chains that had bound me to them for so long. But the peace didn't last. A couple of days later, my ex-wife, Claire, called me out of the blue. I almost didn't answer, but I knew that if I ignored her, she'd just show up at my house like my family had done. So I picked up, bracing myself for whatever she had to say. She started with a polite, almost sweet tone, telling me she understood why I might be reluctant to help after everything that happened. But then she slipped into the same script I'd heard from my parents. She told me it was my chance to be the bigger person, to show maturity and compassion by helping them financially. She even tried to make me feel sympathetic, bringing up how hard things were for my parents and how she'd always done her best to be a good wife to me. Hearing her try to paint herself as the victim was infuriating. I told her that I already provided plenty of help through the alimony payments she'd squeezed out of me in the divorce, payments that she didn't even deserve. She tried to play the guilt card again, crying and saying I was being heartless and that my refusal to help them was selfish. But I didn't back down. That's when her tone changed, hardening into something colder. She told me that if I refused to help, she'd take me to court to demand a higher alimony, using my recent promotion as justification. She claimed she'd drag me through another ugly legal battle if I didn't cooperate. This time, though, I wasn't the broken, defeated person I'd been during the divorce. I wasn't going to let them manipulate me with lies and guilt. I calmly told her to go ahead, that I'd be ready to fight and would bring every piece of evidence I had to show the truth about her and my family's betrayal. I hung up, feeling drained but determined. I was done playing the victim in their twisted game. I'd do whatever it took to defend myself this time, no matter how messy it got. After the call with Claire, I knew this time would be different. I wasn't going to let them walk all over me or twist the truth to make me the villain again. I contacted my lawyer the next day, explaining everything that had happened since the divorce, including Claire's threats for more alimony and my family's endless attempts to guilt me. I was done being their pawn, and my lawyer agreed it was time to push back. I started reaching out to old friends, people who had been there before the drama unfolded, friends who knew my character and had seen me struggle through the marriage. Some of them only knew that Claire and I had separated. They'd never even known the full story. When I told them everything, how she'd been cheating on me with my brother and had tried to trap me with a lie about the baby, they were shocked and outraged. Several of them offered to testify if things went to court. I also reached out to a few family members who'd always known about the favoritism at home. We'd never been close, but they remembered how I'd been treated as an outsider in my own family. They agreed to give statements, recounting how I'd always been pushed aside while my parents praised and supported my brother no matter what he did. For the first time in my life, I felt like I had a team behind me, people who would stand by me and help me set the record straight. Over the next few days, I worked with my lawyer to gather every piece of evidence we could find. I pulled text messages, screenshots, and testimonies from friends who had seen Claire and Tom together. I wanted it all on record, The lies, the manipulation, the betrayal. My lawyer believed we had a solid case to not only stop Claire's alimony demands, but also to protect me from any further harassment from my family. Then a breakthrough came. One of my cousins shared some videos they'd taken at a family gathering years ago. In one of the videos, you could hear my parents talking openly about how lucky they were to have Tom as a son, mentioning that I was too independent and didn't need them like he did. It was subtle, but you could hear the favoritism loud and clear. It was all the proof I needed of the role I'd played in their eyes. A support role, a backup, someone they thought they could push aside until it suited them to reach out. A few days before the court hearing, Claire must have realized how serious I was. She sent me one final message, trying to guilt-trip me once again, telling me how unfair it was that I was dragging the family through this, and that I should just let things go. She tried to bring up our history, as if reminding me of better times would suddenly make me forget how she'd torn my life apart. I didn't reply. There was nothing left to say. The day of the hearing, I arrived at the courthouse prepared. My lawyer laid everything out methodically, presenting every piece of evidence we'd gathered. Claire looked nervous, and for the first time I saw a crack in the arrogance she'd always worn like a shield. My family's lies, her betrayal, their blatant favoritism. It was all laid bare for everyone to see. The judge reviewed the evidence carefully, and by the end of it, I could see the tide had turned. When the judge ruled that the alimony would be discontinued due to the new information brought to light, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. Claire's face was a mix of shock and fury, and I could tell she hadn't expected this outcome. I looked over at her, but I felt nothing. No satisfaction, no anger. Just relief that this chapter was finally over. I walked out of the courthouse that day feeling like a free man. I had reclaimed my life, my dignity, and my peace. For the first time, I felt truly separate from the toxic web my family had tried to keep me trapped in. I was free to move forward without their shadows hanging over me, without their constant demands and manipulations. But of course, my family wouldn't let things end there. It didn't take long for my family to react after the court ruling. The very next day, I came home to find my brother's car parked outside my house. I could see him, my parents, and even Claire standing there waiting for me. It was as if they'd staged some kind of intervention, all of them together, united in their outrage. I took a deep breath, mentally bracing myself as I got out of the car and approached them. Before I could say a word, my father stepped forward looking furious. He launched into a tirade about betraying the family, how I was heartless for cutting off support, how I had let them down. It was the same guilt-ridden script I'd heard 100 times, but now it had lost its power. My mother chimed in, her voice trembling with anger, saying I was disrespecting them and breaking up the family. They seemed completely incapable of acknowledging what they'd done or how they'd treated me for years. I stayed silent, arms crossed, letting them say their piece. Finally, my brother stepped up. He was the angriest of them all, his face twisted with rage. He sneered, calling me a pathetic loser, saying I was just jealous that he'd won in life, taking my family's love, my ex-wife, and everything else he could claim as his. He told me I was nothing, and that I'd always be nothing. When he tried to grab my shirt collar, my father pulled him back, but he didn't stop yelling insults. It was a strange scene. There I was, watching these people who were supposed to be my family screaming at me like I was the villain. And for the first time I felt nothing. No anger, no sadness, no regret. Just a calm acceptance that they had shown me who they were, and I had no part in their lives anymore. Without a word, I turned and walked toward my front door. My brother shouted after me, calling me weak and selfish, threatening to make me pay. I ignored him, knowing his words were hollow. Inside, I could still hear them yelling from the driveway, but their voices faded as I locked the door behind me. I stood there for a moment, feeling the finality of it all. After that day, they tried to reach me a few more times. Calls, texts, even a letter from my mother begging me to reconsider. But I didn't respond. My lawyer sent a cease and desist to make it clear that any further contact would lead to legal action. And finally, the noise stopped. It's been a few months now, and life feels peaceful. I've settled into my work, my routines, and my own space. I've even reconnected with a few old friends. slowly rebuilding the social connections I lost during those turbulent years. Therapy has helped me process the trauma, and with each session I feel like I'm reclaiming parts of myself that were lost under the weight of my family's control. There are days when I still feel echoes of the past, a small pang of regret or a shadow of sadness, but those feelings pass, replaced by the quiet strength of knowing I chose myself. I'm no longer bound by their expectations or haunted by their betrayal. I am free. To anyone who's been through something similar, I hope my story can remind you that it's okay to walk away. Choosing your peace over toxic family dynamics doesn't make you heartless, it makes you strong. Healing isn't linear, but with each step forward, I feel lighter, like I'm finally living a life that's truly mine, and that to me is worth everything.